There is a moment that comes in almost every person's life. It arrives quietly, without announcement, without drama, without any of the ceremony you might expect from something so profoundly significant. It might come at 3 in the morning when you cannot sleep, staring at a ceiling that has become too familiar, feeling the specific weight of a life that is somehow both comfortable and completely wrong. It might come in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, sitting in a meeting or a classroom or a car, watching the minutes of your life tick past in a direction you never consciously chose. It might come when you watch someone else, someone you grew up with, someone who started where you started, someone with no obvious advantages over you, living the kind of life you privately imagined for yourself, and feeling something complicated and uncomfortable rise in your chest that you do not want to examine too closely. It might come when you read something, hear something, see something that cuts through the comfortable numbness of routine and lands, with the precision of a surgeon's blade on the exact place where your unlived potential quietly aches. This moment has a name. It is not called inspiration, although it can feel like that. It is not called ambition, although it can look like that from the outside. It is called the gap. The gap between who you are and who you know, with a certainty that lives deeper than logic, deeper than reason, deeper than every excuse you have ever constructed. You are capable of becoming. You have felt this gap. You are feeling it right now. That is why you pressed play. Not by accident. Not casually. Because something in you recognized that this moment was important, that this content was relevant, that the distance between your current life and the life you were built for has become too significant to keep ignoring. And you were right. Because here is what the most rigorous science of human performance, the most extensive research into exceptional achievement, and the most carefully studied lives of the world's highest performers consistently reveals. The gap between ordinary and extraordinary is not talent. It is not luck. It is not timing, resources, connections, intelligence, or any of the external variables that we so readily reach for when we try to explain why some people live at their full potential and most people do not. The gap is psychological. It lives in the mind. It is made of thought patterns, belief systems, daily habits, emotional intelligence, and a specific set of mental frameworks that successful people use consciously or unconsciously to navigate the world in ways that consistently produce exceptional results. And every single one of those patterns, systems, habits, and frameworks can be learned. Not eventually. Not by some people. By you. Starting today. Starting with the very next thought you choose to think after this sentence. This audiobook is not going to give you a list of tips. It is not going to offer you a collection of motivational quotes and call it transformation. It is going to do something far more useful and far more demanding than that. It is going to show you, from the inside out, how successful people actually think, the specific psychological architecture of high achievement, and then give you the exact tools to build that architecture in yourself. This is not inspiration. This is construction. And by the time we are finished, you will not just feel differently about what is possible. You will think differently. And thinking differently is where everything begins. Part 1. The success psychology nobody teaches you. There is a question that has driven researchers, psychologists, philosophers, and ambitious human beings for as long as ambition has existed. What actually separates the people who succeed from the people who don't? This question has generated libraries of research, decades of longitudinal studies, thousands of biographies and case studies, and interviews with exceptional performers across every domain of human achievement. And the answers, when you strip away the mythology and the oversimplification and the survivorship bias, converge on something surprisingly consistent. something that most educational systems never teach, something that most families never discuss, something that most people spend their entire lives never consciously examining, even as it determines nearly every outcome in their life. In the 1960s, a Stanford University psychologist named Walter Mischel conducted what would become one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. He brought young children, 4 and 5 years old, into a room one at a time and presented them with a simple choice. They could eat one marshmallow now, or they could wait 15 minutes, and if they successfully resisted eating the first marshmallow, they would receive 2 marshmallows. The researchers then left the child alone with the marshmallow and watched through a one-way mirror. What happened next was, on the surface, charming. Some children ate the marshmallow immediately. Some children employed elaborate strategies to resist, covering their eyes, turning away, singing to themselves, sitting on their hands. Some children waited the full 15 minutes and received the second marshmallow. But the truly remarkable findings came years later. When Mischel and his colleagues followed up with the same children as teenagers and then as adults, they found something that startled the entire field of psychology. The children who had waited, who had demonstrated the capacity to delay gratification at age 4, were, as adults, significantly more successful across virtually every measurable dimension of life. Higher academic achievement, better professional outcomes, stronger relationships, better health, lower rates of substance abuse, greater reported life satisfaction. The marshmallow test became famous for the concept of delayed gratification. But what it actually revealed was something deeper and more significant than the simple ability to wait for a reward. What it revealed was the presence, or absence, of a specific psychological capacity that researchers would spend the next 5 decades trying to understand and name. The capacity is this: the ability to act from your long-term identity rather than your short-term impulse. The ability to make choices that reflect who you are trying to become rather than just how you feel in this moment. The ability, in the language of modern neuroscience, to engage your prefrontal cortex, your rational, future-oriented, value-guided brain, rather than surrendering to your limbic system, your emotional, immediate, comfort-seeking brain. This capacity is not fixed at birth. It is not genetic destiny. It is a skill, a trainable, developable, deliberately buildable psychological skill. And it is the foundation on which every other element of success psychology is built. Psychologist Roy Baumeister spent decades studying what he called self-regulation, the capacity to override impulses, manage emotions, and direct behavior in accordance with long-term goals rather than immediate desires. His research, conducted across hundreds of studies involving thousands of participants, produced a finding so consistent and so significant that it transformed our understanding of human achievement. Self-regulation failure is the primary cause of most of the major problems that individuals and societies face. Not lack of intelligence, not lack of opportunity, not lack of knowledge or skill or talent. The failure to consistently act in accordance with one's own stated values and long-term goals. The gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. The gap between intention and behavior. The gap between the person we want to be and the person our habits make us. Now here is what makes this finding both humbling and extraordinarily empowering. If self-regulation failure is the primary cause of most personal struggles, then self-regulation development is the primary solution. And self-regulation is not a mysterious gift bestowed on the fortunate few. It is a skill with known components, known developmental pathways, and known training protocols. It is learnable. It is buildable. And every person listening to this right now has the neurological capacity to develop it. The question is not whether you can. The question is whether you will do what developing it requires. And what it requires is simpler than you might expect. Though simpler does not mean easy. There is a second pillar of success psychology that the research consistently identifies, and it is perhaps even more counterintuitive than the first. It was identified most clearly by psychologist Carol Dweck of Stanford University, whose decades of research on motivation and achievement produced the concept that has since transformed education, sports psychology, business leadership, and personal development around the world. Dweck's central finding is this: the most important determinant of a person's achievement is not their current level of ability. It is their belief about the nature of ability itself. Specifically, whether they believe ability is fixed, a stable, innate trait that you either have or don't, or whether they believe ability is malleable, something that grows and develops through effort, learning, and deliberate practice. Dweck calls these two belief systems the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And the difference between them, in terms of life outcomes, is not subtle. People with a fixed mindset believe that their qualities, their intelligence, their talent, their personality are carved in stone. They have a certain amount of ability, and that's it. This belief creates a very specific and very damaging psychological dynamic. Every challenge becomes a test of whether you have enough of the fixed quality. And because failure in a fixed mindset means you don't have enough, means you are revealed as inadequate, the fixed mindset person becomes extraordinarily risk-averse. They avoid challenges. They give up quickly when things get hard. They feel threatened by others' success. They respond to criticism with defensiveness. They see effort as something only people who lack natural talent need. And most catastrophically, they plateau. They find the level at which they can consistently perform without being exposed, and they stay there. Safe, unchallenged, unexpressed. People with a growth mindset believe something different at a fundamental level. They believe that their qualities are the starting point, not the ceiling. That intelligence, talent, and capability are not fixed endowments but developing capacities, things that grow in response to effort, learning, good strategy, and persistence. This belief creates an entirely different psychological dynamic. Challenges are not tests to be passed or failed. They are opportunities to develop. Failure is not evidence of inadequacy. It is information about what needs to improve. Effort is not a sign of insufficient talent. It is the engine of growth. Criticism is not an attack on the self. It is data to be used. Others' success is not a threat. It is evidence of what's possible. The difference between these two mindsets plays out not in dramatic, visible ways. It plays out in the thousands of small daily choices that compound over time. Whether to try the harder version of the task or the easier one. Whether to ask for feedback or avoid it. Whether to attribute a setback to circumstances or to examine your own role in it. Whether to be inspired or threatened by someone more capable than you. Over days, these choices look similar. Over years, they produce lives that look completely different. Here is perhaps the most important thing Dweck discovered. The growth mindset is not a personality trait you are born with or without. It is a perspective that can be deliberately cultivated. Through awareness. Through the conscious examination of your own beliefs about ability. Through the deliberate practice of responding to challenge, failure, and criticism with curiosity rather than defense. Through the understanding, planted deeply, reinforced repeatedly, that the brain is not a fixed object but a living system that grows stronger through exactly the kind of difficulty that the fixed mindset person spends their life avoiding. You can choose the growth mindset. Not perfectly, not all at once, but incrementally, consistently, decision by decision, response by response, until the new framework becomes the default, until challenge starts to feel like opportunity, until difficulty starts to feel like the specific texture of becoming something you weren't before. Part 2. How winners think differently. There is a consistent pattern in the way exceptionally successful people think that distinguishes them from the general population at a level so fundamental it might as well be a different operating system. This pattern is not about positive thinking in the superficial sense. It is not about believing everything will work out. It is not about affirmations or visualization boards or any of the simplified tools that popular culture has attached to the concept of success mindset. It is something more precise and more powerful than any of those things. It is a specific way of processing reality that consistently produces better decisions, stronger resilience, more creative problem solving, and more sustainable motivation than the thinking patterns of the average person. The first element of winners' thinking is what psychologists call response flexibility. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. This insight, attributed to Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps and built a psychological framework from the wreckage, describes the fundamental difference between reactive and proactive human beings. Reactive people, which is the default state of most people most of the time, allow the gap between stimulus and response to collapse to near zero. Something happens. They react. The reaction is automatic, conditioned, driven by the oldest and most deeply grooved neural pathways, the ones installed in childhood, reinforced by repetition, never consciously examined. Proactive people, people operating with response flexibility, have learned to widen that gap, to pause in the space between what happens and what they do about it, to bring their conscious, value-guided, future-oriented mind to bear on a situation, rather than surrendering immediately to the automatic response. This is not passivity. This is not suppression. Response flexibility does not mean not feeling the initial reaction. It means not being governed by it. It means having enough psychological space between the stimulus and the response to ask, what is the most effective thing I can do here? What response would the best version of me choose? What would the person I am becoming do in this situation? Neuroscience explains why this is so difficult and why developing it is so transformative. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection and emotional response center, processes incoming stimuli faster than the prefrontal cortex. The emotional response arrives before the rational assessment. This is by design. In environments where threats are immediate and physical, the fast emotional response is life-saving. But in the modern world, where most threats are social and psychological rather than physical and immediate, the speed of the amygdala response creates a systematic problem. We are regularly making consequential decisions, saying things, doing things, choosing things from a brain state designed for crisis management rather than thoughtful evaluation. We react from fear when the situation calls for courage. We react from defensiveness when the situation calls for openness. We react from avoidance when the situation calls for engagement. The practice that builds response flexibility is deceptively simple. It is the practice of the deliberate pause. Before responding to anything significant, a difficult email, a tense conversation, a tempting distraction, an impulse to avoid something important, you pause. Not for a long time. Sometimes for one breath. Sometimes for 5 seconds. Sometimes for a night's sleep before sending the email. But the pause itself, the simple act of not responding immediately, is what creates the space for the prefrontal cortex to come online, for the value-guided, future-oriented part of your brain to participate in the decision, for choice to replace reflex, for the person you are becoming to have a voice in the moment, rather than letting the person you've been run the show on autopilot. The second element of winner's thinking is what researchers in cognitive psychology call explanatory style, and we touched on this concept earlier, but it deserves a deeper exploration because of how profoundly it shapes everything that follows in a person's life. Your explanatory style is your habitual way of explaining why things happen, specifically why bad things happen, and it operates along three dimensions that Martin Seligman identified through decades of research: permanence, pervasiveness, personalization. When something goes wrong in your life, when you fail at something, when a relationship doesn't work out, when a project falls short, when an opportunity doesn't materialize, your brain immediately begins constructing an explanation. That explanation is not neutral. It is shaped by your explanatory style. And your explanatory style determines whether the setback becomes a learning experience or a life sentence. People with a pessimistic explanatory style, which research shows is the default for approximately 60% of adults, explain bad events as permanent, pervasive, and personal. Permanent, this always happens. It's never going to change. This is just how things are for me. Pervasive, this affects everything. If this doesn't work, nothing works. This failure contaminates my whole life. Personal, this happened because of something fundamentally wrong with me. I am the problem. I am inadequate. This explanatory style is, in Seligman's research, the psychological fingerprint of depression, chronic underperformance, and what he originally called learned helplessness. The person with this style does not just experience failure. They generalize failure into identity. They transform a specific, temporary, situational event into a permanent, global, personal verdict. And they live from that verdict. People with an optimistic explanatory style, which research shows is learnable, trainable, and developable, explain bad events as temporary, specific, and external. Temporary, this didn't work right now. The situation can change. This is not permanent. Specific, this particular thing failed. Other things are fine. This doesn't contaminate everything. External, there were contributing factors here. I played a role, and I'll examine my role honestly, but I am not the sole cause, and this is not a verdict on my fundamental worth. This is not denial. This is not the refusal to take responsibility. Notice that the optimistic style does not say, "It wasn't my fault." It says, "This was specific, temporary, and examinable, not permanent, global, and identity-defining." The optimistic explainer takes responsibility for their role without catastrophizing it into a statement about who they fundamentally are. They learn from failure without becoming defined by it. They experience setbacks without being stopped by them. The third element of winner's thinking is what performance psychologists call process orientation. Most people are outcome-oriented. They are focused on results, the destination, the achievement, the goal, the reward. And while outcome orientation is not inherently problematic, it creates a specific vulnerability that consistently undermines performance. When the outcome is uncertain, which it always is, the outcome-oriented person's motivation, confidence, and emotional stability fluctuate with the perceived probability of success. When things are going well, they feel good. When things are uncertain or difficult, they feel bad. Their internal state is hostage to external results. Winners, by contrast, are primarily process-oriented. They are focused on the quality of their engagement with the work, the standard they bring to each individual action, the consistency of their effort, the quality of their attention. This orientation produces something that outcome orientation structurally cannot. Sustainable motivation that does not depend on external validation. Because the process-oriented person can succeed in the psychological sense, in the sense of feeling competent and purposeful and aligned, in every single moment of genuine effort, regardless of how the outcome eventually resolves. The outcome is never fully in their control. The process always is. And by focusing relentlessly on what they can control, the quality of their daily practice, the consistency of their effort, the standard they bring to each individual action, they maximize their probability of good outcomes while maintaining the psychological stability that allows them to continue performing at high levels regardless of what the external scoreboard currently says. Part 3. The Architecture of Daily Excellence. Excellence is not an event. It is not a peak performance. It is not the dramatic moment of achievement that gets photographed and remembered and recounted in interviews. Excellence is a daily practice. It is built in the ordinary hours, the early mornings before the world is watching, the moments of choice when comfort is immediately available and discipline requires something extra, the quiet, consistent repetitions that accumulate over time into a life of extraordinary quality. Researcher Anders Ericsson spent decades studying the development of expert performance across domains ranging from chess to surgery to music to sport. His research, which formed the basis of Malcolm Gladwell's popularization of the 10,000-hour rule, is far more nuanced and more instructive than the simplified version suggests. What Ericsson actually found was not simply that 10,000 hours of practice produces expertise. What he found was that the quality of practice matters far more than the quantity. Specifically, deliberate practice, a specific kind of highly focused, feedback-oriented, continuously challenging engagement with skill development, is what produces expert performance. Not just doing something repeatedly. Not just accumulating hours of experience. Deliberate practice. Deliberate practice has specific characteristics that distinguish it from ordinary practice. It operates at the edge of current capability, challenging enough to require full concentration, not so difficult as to be impossible. It involves immediate feedback, specific information about performance that allows for rapid correction and adjustment. It requires full concentration, not the divided attention of someone practicing while also watching television or checking their phone, but the complete engagement of someone whose entire cognitive resources are directed at improving a specific element of performance. It is uncomfortable, because working at the edge of capability always involves encountering your current limitations, which is inherently uncomfortable for a nervous system that prefers the familiar. And it is transformative, because the brain, when subjected to this kind of focused, effortful, feedback-rich engagement, builds new neural connections at a rate that ordinary practice simply cannot match. The architecture of daily excellence, built on the foundation of deliberate practice, has several key components that research consistently identifies as non-negotiable. The first component is the morning architecture. The first hour of your day is not like other hours. It is the hour during which your brain transitions from the highly receptive, lightly filtered state of early morning waking, a state neurologically similar to the theta state of early childhood, to the fully activated, critically engaged state of normal waking consciousness. In this transitional state, you are more programmable than at any other point in the day. Your dominant thoughts in this hour will set the emotional tone, the attentional orientation, and the expectation framework for everything that follows. Most people spend this hour in the worst possible way. They immediately expose their programmable morning mind to news, social media, other people's agendas, notifications, problems that require reactive responses, and a flood of information that has nothing to do with who they are trying to become. They hand the first hour of their day, the most powerful programming window available to them, to algorithm designers whose explicit objective is to capture and monetize attention. And then they wonder why they feel reactive, distracted, anxious, and unmotivated by 9 o'clock. High performers almost universally protect the morning, not because they follow the same routine. The specific content of a morning practice varies enormously across individuals and domains. But the principle is consistent. Before engaging with the world's agenda, engage with your own. Before being reactive to external inputs, set your own internal orientation. Before the noise of the day makes it difficult to hear your own signal, spend time with the question of who you are trying to be and what today needs to serve that becoming. Whether that time is spent in silence, in physical movement, in reading, in writing, in meditation, in deliberate visualization of the day ahead, the function is the same. Claiming ownership of your own psychology before the world makes its claim on your attention. This is not a luxury. This is not something reserved for people with perfect schedules and no obligations. It is the foundational daily practice of self-directed human beings. And it is available to anyone willing to wake up 20 minutes earlier and use those minutes intentionally. The second component is the discipline of deep work. Cal Newport, professor at Georgetown University, and author of one of the most important books on professional excellence published in the last decade, defines deep work as professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive capabilities to their limit. Deep work, Newport argues, is becoming simultaneously more rare and more valuable. More rare because the constant connectivity of modern professional life creates an environment of continuous partial attention, a state in which most people are perpetually available to interruption, never fully engaged with anything for long enough to do their best thinking. More valuable because the problems worth solving, the work worth doing, the contributions worth making, consistently require the kind of sustained, focused cognitive engagement that only deep work provides. Research on cognitive performance is unambiguous. Human beings do not multitask. They task switch. And task switching, the rapid movement of attention between multiple items, is extraordinarily costly. Each switch costs an attentional residue, a portion of your cognitive resources that remains partially engaged with the previous task, even after you have nominally moved to the next one. The cumulative effect of a workday spent in continuous task switching is a brain that has never been fully present for anything, that has distributed its resources thinly across many things, rather than concentrating them powerfully on the things that matter most. The practice of deep work is the deliberate reversal of this pattern. It is the daily commitment to spending a defined, protected block of time in complete, single-pointed focus on the most important work you have to do. Not the most urgent work. Not the work that generates the most immediate social reward. The most important work. The work that moves the needle on the things that actually matter to the person you are trying to become. The third component is the evening architecture. The way you end your day shapes the brain you wake up with tomorrow. Sleep is not just rest. It is active processing, the period during which the brain consolidates memories, integrates learning, regulates emotional residue, and prepares itself for the next day's engagement with the world. The quality of that processing depends significantly on the state of your nervous system when you enter sleep. A nervous system flooded with stress hormones from late evening news consumption, stimulated by the blue light of screens, engaged in the unresolved processing of emotional content immediately before sleep, This nervous system does not recover fully overnight. It does not consolidate well. It does not regulate effectively. And the brain it produces the next morning is measurably less capable, less focused, less emotionally regulated, less creative, less resilient than the brain that follows genuine recovery sleep. The evening architecture is not complicated. It involves protecting the final hour before sleep from the same inputs that the morning practice protects against. It involves a brief review of the day, not a harsh self-judgment, but an honest, growth-oriented assessment of what went well, what didn't, and what tomorrow needs. That closes the day's cognitive loops and prevents the brain from running those loops unresolved through the night. It involves creating conditions for physical sleep quality: darkness, coolness, quiet, the absence of screens, that research consistently identifies as foundational to cognitive and emotional performance. And it involves, perhaps most importantly, the deliberate cultivation of gratitude, which neuroscience shows measurably shifts the brain's default emotional tone, reducing the overnight dominance of the threat detection system and increasing the baseline availability of positive affect the following morning. Part 4. Mastering Your Emotional Intelligence. In 1995, science journalist Daniel Goleman published a book with a thesis so provocative that it challenged one of the most fundamental assumptions of Western intellectual culture. The thesis was this: IQ is not the most important predictor of life success. Emotional intelligence is. The book, simply titled Emotional Intelligence, synthesized decades of research from psychologists including Peter Salovey and John Mayer, whose original academic work on emotional intelligence had quietly been transforming the field of psychology for years before Goleman brought it to popular attention. Emotional intelligence, the capacity to recognize, understand, manage, and effectively use emotions in yourself and others, had been consistently showing up in research as a more powerful predictor of professional success, relationship quality, leadership effectiveness, mental health, and life satisfaction than traditional measures of cognitive ability. Not instead of cognitive ability. In addition to it, and far more trainable than cognitive ability, which has a much higher genetic component. The 4 components of emotional intelligence that Salovey and Mayer identified are: perceiving emotions, the ability to accurately read emotional information in faces, voices, body language, and other expressive channels; using emotions, the ability to harness emotional information to facilitate thinking, creativity, and problem solving; understanding emotions, the knowledge of how emotions work, how they develop, how they interact, and how they change over time; managing emotions, the capacity to regulate your own emotional responses and to influence the emotional states of others in constructive ways. Of these 4 components, emotional management is the one that most directly impacts the daily quality of your decisions, your relationships, and your performance. And emotional management begins with something that most people never do. It begins with emotional literacy, the ability to accurately name what you are feeling. This sounds trivially simple. It is not. Research by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio and others has shown that most people have a remarkably limited emotional vocabulary and a correspondingly limited capacity for emotional self-awareness. They know they feel bad. They know they feel good. They have a vague sense of something being wrong or right. But the specific texture of what they're feeling, the difference between anxiety and excitement, between sadness and disappointment, between anger and hurt, between boredom and emptiness, remains murky. And what is murky cannot be managed. What is murky gets expressed without intention, acted from without awareness, and left unaddressed to compound over time into the kind of emotional dysregulation that destroys relationships, undermines performance, and creates the chronic sense of being at the mercy of your own internal weather. The practice of emotional literacy is the daily discipline of precise emotional labeling. When you notice an emotional state arising, you resist the urge to either act immediately from it or suppress it and move on. Instead, you pause. You turn your attention inward. And you ask with genuine curiosity, what exactly am I feeling right now? Not what do I think about what I'm feeling. What is the feeling itself? Where do I feel it in my body? What does it most precisely resemble from my vocabulary of human emotional experience? Neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA found that this simple act, the precise verbal labeling of emotional experience, measurably reduces activation in the amygdala. The act of naming the emotion literally calms the brain's threat response. Not because the emotion disappears, but because the act of labeling shifts processing from the emotional center to the prefrontal cortex, from the reactive brain to the thoughtful brain. You move from being inside the emotion to observing the emotion. And from observation, wise response becomes possible. The second crucial emotional intelligence practice is what psychologists call empathic accuracy, the capacity to accurately understand the emotional experience of other people. This capacity is foundational to every significant human relationship, to leadership, to negotiation, to parenting, to friendship, to every form of collaboration and community that makes human life meaningful. And it is more learnable than most people believe. Research by Jamal Zaki at Stanford's Social Neuroscience Laboratory has demonstrated something that overturns a common assumption about empathy. Most people believe empathy is a fixed trait. You either have a lot of it or a little, and that's essentially that. Zaki's research shows this is wrong. Empathy is malleable. It increases with practice. Specifically, it increases with the practice of genuine curiosity about other people's inner lives. The deliberate asking of the question, what is it like to be you? Not as a rhetorical gesture, as a genuine inquiry, as the recognition that every person you encounter carries a complete inner world, a history of experience, a collection of fears and hopes and wounds and strengths that you cannot see from the outside, and that shapes everything about how they move through the world. When you approach other people with this curiosity, when you replace the automatic tendency to evaluate and judge and compare with the genuine desire to understand, something shifts in your relationships, your communication, and your capacity to create the conditions under which other people can do their best. You become more effective, more trusted, more capable of the kind of genuine human connection that makes everything, work, family, friendship, community, richer and more meaningful. Part 5. Building UNSHAKABLE Confidence. Confidence is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in the entire canon of personal development. The popular mythology presents confidence as a feeling, a specific internal state, warm and certain and steady, that some people have and others lack, that arrives as a gift or is withheld as a punishment, that must be present before action can be taken. This mythology is not just wrong. It is destructively wrong, because it reverses the actual causal relationship between confidence and action. And the reversal costs people their potential. Here is what the research actually shows. Confidence does not precede action. Confidence follows action. Specifically, confidence is built through the accumulation of evidence that you are capable of doing difficult things, evidence that is only produced by actually doing difficult things. Psychologist Albert Bandura, whose work on self-efficacy is among the most replicated and most influential in the history of social psychology, identified 4 sources of the belief in one's own capability. The first and most powerful is mastery experience. The direct, personal experience of having accomplished something difficult. Not being told you can do something. Not watching someone else do it. Not reading about how it's done. Actually doing it. And discovering, through the doing, that you were capable of more than you believed. Each mastery experience deposits confidence in a psychological account. And the account, built over time through the accumulation of these experiences, becomes the foundation of what Bandura calls self-efficacy, the specific belief in your capacity to produce outcomes in particular domains. The critical implication of this finding is this: you cannot think your way to confidence. You cannot affirmation your way to confidence. You cannot wait for confidence before taking action, because the confidence you're waiting for is only produced by the actions you're avoiding. The only path to genuine, durable, evidence-based confidence is through the specific experiences that produce it, which means doing the things you are afraid of. Not all at once, not without support, not beyond the limits of what is genuinely safe and wise, but consistently, progressively, with the understanding that every act of courage, however small, is a deposit in your confidence account. And the account grows. Every time. Without exception. The second source of self-efficacy in Bandura's framework is vicarious experience, learning through observation of others who are similar to you succeeding at the tasks you are trying to master. This is not mere inspiration. It is specific psychological information. When you see someone who started where you started, who has similar resources and similar obstacles, doing something you have believed you cannot do, your brain updates its probability estimate. Not just emotionally, neurologically. The observation of similar author success measurably increases belief in one's own capacity. This is why the people you spend time with matter so profoundly. Not as abstract inspiration, as neurological calibration. The people around you set your reference point for what is normal, what is possible, and what people like you are capable of. Surround yourself with people who are operating at or above the level you aspire to reach, and your brain's estimate of what is possible for you rises automatically. Surround yourself exclusively with people who have never pushed beyond comfortable limits, and your brain has no vicarious evidence to draw on, no similar author success to update its probability estimates with. You are not just choosing your social life when you choose who you spend time with. You are choosing the ceiling of your psychological possibility. The third component of building unshakable confidence is the management of what psychologists call self-talk, the continuous internal commentary that narrates your experience, evaluates your performance, and predicts your future. Research is clear that self-talk quality is one of the strongest predictors of performance under pressure. Athletes who speak to themselves encouragingly, specifically, and constructively in high-pressure situations outperform those whose self-talk is critical, global, and catastrophic. Professionals who maintain a constructive internal narrative during difficult projects sustain performance quality longer than those who spiral into self-criticism at the first sign of difficulty. Students who use supportive self-talk during examinations score measurably higher than those who default to anxious, critical internal commentary. The practice is the systematic construction of a self-talk vocabulary, a set of specific, personally meaningful, evidence-based phrases that you deploy deliberately in high-pressure, hideout moments. Not generic affirmations. Specific, personal, evidence-rooted reminders of your actual capacity. I have done hard things before. I can do this. I don't need certainty. I need commitment. The difficulty is the point. This is where I grow. I am prepared for this moment. I have been building toward this. These are not magical incantations. They are attentional anchors, specific cognitive content that you deliberately bring to mind to redirect attention away from the threat-focused, catastrophizing noise of the inner critic and toward the more accurate, more empowering, more constructive assessment of your actual capacity. The final chapter, the life you were built to live. Everything in this audiobook has been moving toward a single destination. Not a destination you arrive at and then remain. A destination you arrive at and then discover is actually a new beginning. The life you were built to live. The phrase sounds grand. It sounds like the kind of thing printed on motivational posters and forgotten by Monday. But I want to strip it of its sentimentality and offer it to you as something more precise and more demanding than inspiration. Because the life you were built to live is not a fantasy. It is not a vague aspiration. It is the specific, particular, individual life that becomes available to a person who has done the psychological work we have been discussing, who has understood and begun to dismantle their limiting beliefs, who has developed the mindset of a winner, who has built the daily architecture of excellence, who has cultivated emotional intelligence and built confidence through action, and who is now operating from a significantly expanded version of their own psychological possibility. It is specific. It looks like the career you have been building toward, rather than settling away from. It looks like the relationships in which you are fully present and fully yourself, rather than strategically reduced. It looks like the creative work you have been afraid to pursue being pursued with the full force of your attention and talent. It looks like the physical life, the body, the health, the energy that results from consistently treating yourself as someone worth taking care of. It looks like the financial life that becomes possible when self-sabotage stops undermining what discipline and intelligence are building. It looks like, most fundamentally, the experience of being who you actually are, fully, unapologetically, without the constant monitoring and management and reduction that living from limiting beliefs requires. Here is what I want you to understand about that life. It is not waiting for you to become perfect. It is not waiting for you to resolve every psychological issue, eliminate every trace of self-doubt, develop every skill to its highest level, and arrive at some complete and finished version of yourself. It is not waiting at all. It is available in the very next decision you make. In the very next moment, you choose the growth mindset response to a challenge rather than the fixed mindset retreat. In the very next conversation, where you say what you actually think rather than what you calculate will be most received. In the very next morning, where you protect the first hour for the development of your own psychological and professional capacity, rather than handing it to someone else's agenda. In the very next moment where the inner critic speaks and you notice it, name it, and choose differently. The life you were built to live is not a destination. It is a direction. And you are either moving toward it or away from it in every moment of every day. Not in dramatic ways. In the quiet, private, ordinary ways that accumulate. The choices nobody sees. The standards you hold when no one is watching. The work you do in the absence of recognition or applause or external motivation. The commitment you maintain when the initial excitement has faded and what remains is simply the choice, made again in a quiet moment, to continue. I want to speak directly to whatever part of you doubts this. The part that has listened to everything in this audiobook and found it compelling and true and important, and is already beginning to construct the argument for why it applies to other people, but perhaps not quite to you. Because you have a specific history, a specific set of circumstances, a specific collection of wounds and failures and limitations that make your situation different enough that the general principles, while true in general, might not quite reach the particular reality of your particular life. I know that part of you. It has been running since the beginning of this recording. It is extremely good at its job. And it is wrong. Not because your history isn't real. Not because your circumstances aren't genuine. Not because the wounds aren't wounds, or the failures weren't failures, or the limitations aren't limitations. But because none of those things, none of them, represent the ceiling of what you are capable of. They represent the floor you are standing on. The floor is real. The floor is where you are. The floor is not where you have to stay. The research on human potential, accumulated across a century of psychology and neuroscience and performance science, points in one consistent direction. The human capacity for growth, for change, for the development of new capabilities and the transcendence of old limitations, is vastly greater than the average person's life reflects. Not infinitely greater. Not magically, effortlessly greater. But specifically, measurably, consistently greater, for people who do the work we have been discussing, than the limiting beliefs would have you conclude. The distance between where you are and where you could be is not fixed. It is not predetermined. It is a function of the daily choices you are making, right now, and will continue to make, one moment at a time, for the rest of your life. You have spent time today with the psychology of success. You have encountered the research on mindset and self-regulation and deliberate practice and emotional intelligence and confidence, and the specific ways that winners think and act and build their days. You have, I hope, recognized something of yourself in this, both the patterns that have been limiting you and the capacities that are available to you. Now comes the part that the audiobook cannot do for you. The part where you decide what to do with what you've heard. The people who change are not the people who heard the most compelling content. They are the people who, having heard compelling content, took one specific action. One small, concrete today action. Not the grand gesture. Not the complete life overhaul. The next step. The step that says, I heard this, I recognize something true in it, and I am going to do one thing differently today because of it. Maybe that step is 5 minutes of protected morning time before you look at your phone. Maybe it is one honest conversation you have been postponing. Maybe it is one application you have been afraid to submit, one project you have been afraid to start, one limit you have been afraid to set. Maybe it is simply the decision, made quietly, privately, without announcement, to begin treating yourself as someone whose potential is real and worth investing in. Whatever it is, take it today. Not tomorrow. Not when things settle down. Not when you feel ready, because readiness is a feeling that arrives only after the action, never before it. Today, with the fear present, with the doubt present, with the imperfection of a beginning that doesn't know yet what it is becoming. Because that is where every extraordinary life has started. Not in perfection, not in certainty, not in the presence of all the resources and all the skills and all the confidence that the finished version of the story will eventually include, but in a moment exactly like this one, a moment of recognition, a moment of decision, a moment of taking the next step in the direction of the life you were built to live. That moment is now. The step is yours. Take it.